Cornish Saints and Sinners by J. Henry Harris.
Chapter 6. Our square-set friend owned up to smuggling as one of the virtues of his countrymen. The real thing is getting scarce now. One evening he brought an old acquaintance with him, introducing him crisply as Uncle Bill. We saw a good deal of Uncle Bill afterwards, and who was 90 next birthday, and ready and willing to fight, wrestle, or run with any man of his age in this country or the next. We did not doubt him, for his blue eye was clear, he moved easily, and his pink fingertips and filbert-shaped nails showed breed. Uncle Bill looked as though he intended to carry out his bat for a century or more. He was, he said, as sound as a bell, except that he was a bit titched on the wind when walking against a hill. Never took doctor's trade, as he contemptuously called physic, and his cure for all ills was a pipe of bacca to smoke and a pennard of gin mixed with a pennard of porter. He said he had done a little smuggling, in the old-fashioned way, in a small lugger, running for dear life across the channel in a gale of wind when the king's cutters were all snug in harbour, and then landing the tubs of spirits and parcels of lace and other things under the very noses of the preventive men. "He didn't prevent we," said Uncle Bill, his face all aglow with the pleasures of memory. He told us that he settled down to fishing when his calling, and that of his father before him, was interfered with. But the dash and peril and the fame of successful smuggling suited him, and warmed up the cockles of his heart, now only to think about. He spoke of himself as an injured man, because he received no compensation for disturbance. Guy worked at the subject, and came to the conclusion that Cornwall was as intended by nature for smuggling as the inhabitants were for carrying it on. Every little bay and creek and cavern, villages and farmhouses, even the tombs in the parish churches could tell tales. And the women? They were hand in glove with their husbands and sweethearts, fathers and brothers. And all that made life worth living then was made dependent on a successful run from a little French port, with goods honestly bought and paid for. But the sorrow and the shame of it made contraband the moment they touched English soil. Bad laws made smugglers, said the Bookworm provokingly to Guy, who always fires up with professional wrath when he hears of anything bad in connection with the law. Bad fiddlesticks! People smuggled because they liked it, just as you liked it when you smuggled those nice little Tauchnitz editions last year, and without thinking of the poor devil of an author in England that you were robbing, replied Guy. That never occurred to me, said the Bookworm meekly. Of course not. You are only a petty smuggler, but a smuggler all the same. And do you mean to tell me that bad laws, forsooth, made you smuggle the books? Not a bit of it. You liked the game, and you know it. There is a grandeur about the old smuggler which increases with age. He put his little all upon a venture, nothing of the limited liability principle about him. The lugger which left a Cornish fishing cove was, as a rule, family property, owned by father and sons, or by 2 or 3 brothers. The family capital was put into one purse, carried away, and converted into honest brandy, wines, and other articles of commerce. Then the struggle commenced between the individual who pitted his own cunning and frail boat against the king's cruisers and all the resources of a mighty state. He was surrounded by spies from the moment his cargo was on board until he was ready to slip from the moorings. He could trust no man. And then his voyage Across the channel was a race for life, in fog, in tempest, when only a madman would run the risk. The old smuggler would up sail and off, and if a king's officer liked to follow, then all he'd see would be the drippings from the smuggler's keel. The god of storms was the smuggler's divinity, and he loved his little craft, which was, for the time, a thing of life, fleeing from pursuit, from imprisonment, and even death, when cannonballs flew about. How the old smuggler prayed for storm and night, for any peril which would enable him to show courage and mastery over the elemental forces, which should drive his pursuers to destruction. And how he would fight when brought to bay, when becalmed. The king's cutter would send a boat alongside to board the lugger, every man armed with pistol and cutlass, and wearing the uniform of authority. Then the smuggler would fight for property and life, cast off the grappling irons, and cut down the man who ventured to set foot upon his little craft. And all the while the old man at the helm looked fixedly at the heavens and across the water to see if, perchance, a breath of wind was stirring. Only a breath might be his salvation when he was too far inshore for the king's cutter to venture, and his men fighting off the cutter's crew like heroes. Then a puff, and the sail draws, then more wind, and inch by inch the lugger sails away from cutter and cutter's crew, only perhaps to fall in with another enemy, which has to be outsailed or outmaneuvered or fought off, as best serves the purpose. No surrender when boat and cargo is the bread of the family. Then the old smuggler reaches home, and every shadow may spell ruin, and all that is done in fear, and he has to be cunning always and ready to fight to the death. The old smuggler belonged to the heroic age, and in all genuine stories he bulks colossal against a midnight sky black with tempest. The race has not disappeared. The conditions have changed. That is all. Uncle Bill told us that he could find a crew tomorrow if there was but a fair prospect of making £500 on the venture. And I'd be one, said he. If nature intended a county for smuggling, it is Cornwall, which seems somehow to have been caught when cooling between two seas and pressed inward and upward, so that it is full of little bights and bays and caverns which might have been vents for the gases to escape, when the sea pressure at the sides became unbearable, and the earth groaned like the bell of the season in tight corsets. The caverns are given up to bats and otters and slimy things now, but in the good old days the women, by all accounts, took kindly to smuggling and stood shoulder to shoulder with their men when there was a fight with the preventive men, and ran off with the tubs of spirits and whatever they could carry, whilst the men held the king's officers in check. A young man who was content with a living wage on sea or on land wasn't thought much of by the black-haired, black-eyed damsels of the coast, who were up to snuff in the free trade principles of their day and generation. The children were taught to look upon the sea as their own, and to regard smuggling as an honourable calling, and thousands of infant tongues prayed at night for God's blessing on smuggling ventures. And the church was with the people, and motto-bound upon the smugglers' arms and hearts, like phylacteries, and was to them as prayer. Uncle Bill had a pennard of gin in his beer to clear his pipes one evening, and told us some yarns which he had heard from his father, who was called Enoch, who died in his bed at the age of 96, and would have lived longer, only he catched a cold draw washing his feet in fresh water. Uncle Bill was a young man, but not too young to go courting when his father made his last run across the channel for a cargo of spirits. It came about in this way. Enoch and his family possessed 500 £1 notes issued by a bank which had failed, and so were practically worthless. This was a serious matter, and Enoch proposed, at the family council, to run across to Brittany and exchange the worthless notes for tubs of good brandy. Everything was done in secrecy, and in hot haste to prevent suspicion, and to get the cargo of contraband on board before news of the bank's failure reached the French merchants. Had they been members of the Japanese intelligence department, they could not have kept the secret better. They had a splendid run, landed the cargo all serene, and cleared cent per cent. "I have often blessed God that there were no telegraphs in those days," said Uncle Bill fervently. "What became of the notes?" asked Guy. "I don't know," replied Uncle Bill with a lively wink. "All I know is we had the brandy." "Is this genuine or only make-up?" asked Guy. "As true as the gospel," replied Uncle Bill. He told us many other stories, but we thought this best worth preserving, as it showed native cunning, promptness, and audacity. "And I have lived to hear a man bless God that there were no such things as electric telegraphs," said the Bookworm, realizing that he was now in an England of a century ago. Uncle Bill was a good old sort, and once, when he came to see us, he pulled a medicine bottle from the folds of his knitted frock, and taking out the cork, invited us to taste. It was pure cognac, and its flavour was what the old man called rich. The spirit had not been coloured, and had a history which the old man told with relish. News was one day brought to the coastguard station by a boatman that a cask was stranded on an adjacent beach, and the coastguard officer, who loved his joke and good company, summoned numerous good men and true, Uncle Bill being one, to go to the beach, and there hold an inquest upon the said cask and its contents. "My men," said the coastguard officer, "I summon you in the name of the Queen, God bless her, to come with me to Tregunna Beach, and to taste the contents of a cask, which we shall find there. I think it's a brandy cask," he added, "and you are to act as Queen's tasters. Now, my men, if you declare that the contents of the cask are wines or spirits, then the same will be seized on behalf of the Crown, and the excise will claim it. And if you further declare that the contents taste of salt water, then the cask will be staved in, and the contents run out upon the beach. You are the jurors, and meet me here in half an hour. If any of ye have a tin can, it might be handy," said he with a wink. When the jurors met again, they all had something in their hands in the shape of tin cans or pitchers, and there were men upon this jury who had not tasted spirits at their own expense for many years, and they carried the largest pitchers. The coastguard officer produced a gimlet and broached the cask, and every man tasted. "The smell of it was enough for me," said Uncle Bill, "but I tasted like the rest. Went down handsome, sure enough. And some of us tasted again to make sure for sartin," says the coastguard officer. "What is it, my men?" "Cognac." "So say you all. One and all for sure. Then I seize the cask in the Queen's name." He took out a bit of chalk and marked the broad arrow upon it, but our jugs were empty. The best of the game was to come. "Now, my men, tell me, as good men and true, whether the brandy has been touched with salt water." So we all tasted again, and said it was sickly and brackish, and made such faces that you might think we were poisoned. "And so say you all?" "Yes, one and all." "And your verdict is that the cask of brandy, seized in the Queen's name, is brackish?" "That is our verdict." "Then I order the cask to be stove in, and its contents run upon the beach." And when the head was stove in, he turned his back upon us, and every can and jug and pitcher was filled. And if we'd only known, we'd have had more pails and buckets and pitchers. "I've got a drop still left, and it's precious," said Uncle Bill. The medicine bottle was his gift to us, and we now knew the flavour of cognac cast upon the shore, which had never paid the Queen's penny. I don't wonder that smuggling was popular, said Guy. Smuggling made the sort of sailor that Nelson loved, a man who could fight and forgive when worsted, like the old smuggler of Talland, who had it recorded on his tombstone that he prayed God to pardon those wicked preventive men who shed his innocent blood. It was in the Lizard district that smuggling reached its zenith. The Bookworm put a copy of the autobiography of a smuggler into his pocket when he tramped over to Prussia Cove, a place which nature and a little art intended for an emporium for smugglers. Blind harbours, blind caves, hidden galleries, mysterious inlets and exits form a delicate network of safety and concealment. Only a century ago, the man who lived here was the king of Cornish smugglers and privateers, and defended himself with his own cannon. Now the fine caves are fern-arched, and the water drips, drips, drips upon nothing precious. The smugglers borrowed these caves from the Piskies, who have re-entered into possession, for here are the Piskey sands and Piskey caves. Here in cool grot the Piskies dwell, hummed Guy. The caves seem none the worse for having been smugglers' storehouses, but the ginger beer and sandwich man left his trail as usual. What he couldn't reach or cut down he left alone, but broken glass he left behind. Guy ran across a gentleman anxious to tell us things. He was a pensioner. The man with a pension is a common object by the seashore. After a time, you get to know him as a superior sort of being, reduced from his high estate, and only making the two ends meet by the grace of God. Get a pension and don't worry, is a very good advice when the pension is big enough. But generally the pension man is a trifle seedy. His pension won't spread all over him, but leaves him minus gloves, with patched shoes and short everywhere. This honest old gentleman was Guy's find, and he was so eager to tell all he knew, and more on top of it, that Guy was glad, at last, to get rid of him with some excuse covered deftly with a small consideration. Chapter 7. There is a good deal of history in Cornwall. Some may be read in stones and some in books. The stone reading is very interesting to those who like it, and affords a good scope for imagination. Without imagination, stone reading is a trifle dull. Stones are everywhere, at the Land's End and Lizard. Some are stationary and some rock, and all are weather-worn. The Bookworm had a trick of running his hands over the surfaces of prehistoric monuments, like a blind man reading. It was just a fancy of his that he was shaking hands with antiquity. Our Mr. Square-set put his pencil mark in our Murray against what is called the show stones, and he couldn't tell us much more than we could find out for ourselves. We thought it best to let ancient stone history alone, until we had a dull Sunday or a wet day, and look out for what was nearer our own times. We found that the Cornishman's motto is one for all, and that one comes first. So he says, I and the king. And when he speaks geographically, it is Cornwall first, then England, and then the rest. Formerly everything outside of England was Cornwall, but he is not so sure now. However, he always takes a bit of the old county with him when he travels, so that the Piskies may find him. A Cornishman abroad is given to wishedness, and so he gets up clubs in London and other places and talks of pasties and cream, blue skies and sapphire seas, and sings Trelawney and dances the flurry dance, and one and all's it generally. The Cornish had their own kings and queens, and as the kings were liberal to themselves in the matter of queens, they were not, always happy. The Bookworm helped us a good deal at times and told us that the ancient kings were not much given to diplomatic correspondence, nor to the keeping of memorials of the reign, so that modern historians had a pretty free hand. The kings, however, must have been numerous at one time, as there was a king at Gweek and another at Marazion, as thick as tenants on a gentleman's estate. Cornish history had, however, been worked up by poets, and the characters of the old kings, drawn by Tennyson and Kingsley, were not too amiable. There was Tennyson's Cornish king, who had an uncomfortable way of sneaking round on tiptoe and striking a man in the back. The poet had not made allowance for the fact that King Mordred lived in days before private inquiry offices were invented, and so was obliged to do his own dirty work instead of employing a professional spy at per hour and expenses. For real knowledge of Cornish kings, Kingsley whips creation. Listen. Fat was the feasting and loud was the harping in the halls of Aleph, king of Gweek. There was going to be a wedding, so that may pass. Then we come to details worthy of the poet-historian. Savoury was the smell of fried pilchard and hake. More savoury still that of roast porpoise. Most savoury of all that of 50 huge squab pies, built up of layers of apples, bacon, onions, and mutton, and at the bottom of each a squab, a young cormorant, which diffused both through the pie and through the ambient air a delicate odour of mingled guano and polecat. There was a little toddy, of course, to wash it down, and a few songs with harp accompaniment, and the bride, being properly elated with the perfume of guano and polecat, was very civil, and being a princess in her own right and queen of Marazion, gave the vocalist a ring to remember her by. The next morning the newly wedded pair start off on their honeymoon, and this is what happens. The king of Marazion grips his bride's arm until she screams and says, "And you shall pass your bridal night in my dog kennel, after my dog whip has taught you not to give rings again to wandering harpers." Tennyson and Kingsley have been read pretty generally by men and women of the Anglo-Saxon race, and some people may even think that the Cornish kings were like these portraits and fed upon guano and polecat flavoured pies, and whipped their brides to sleep in dog kennels in their bridal garments. Poets have always been privileged. There were Cornish kings, of course, just as there were Cornish saints, and a Cornish language, and all three played their little parts and went off the stage, without even the lights being turned down for them. With regard to the kings, this seemed to have happened when the local rates and taxes were getting too high, and trouble was brewing about the Education Act. The king saw that they must go under and gave way to a duke. Edward the Black Prince, having won his spurs in the Crusades, the kings asked him to take over what they could no longer keep or didn't want. And so, like a Cornishman's gift, what he does not want for himself became a proverb. The proverb may be relied on as authentic. The Prince of Wales has been the Duke of Cornwall ever since. So the Cornish people have had a very close connection with royalty from prehistoric times, as the Bookworm discovered, then through Kingsley's guano and polecat period, and then from Edward the Black Prince down to the present, which we can verify for ourselves every year, when the duchy accounts are published, and the ancient tribute passes into the noble duke's banking account. History loses much of its charm for poets and romantic souls when it enters the prosaic region of banker's ledger and checkbook, but this sort of prose has advantages. The Cornish had a long way to walk when they wanted just to talk matters over with their sovereign. They went in their thousands to London on several occasions when things were not to their liking, and the late Queen was the first sovereign of the realm to come into the county, and God bless the people on their own doorsteps. Charles I came into the county under very peculiar circumstances, and though he was qualifying for martyrdom, he found time to write a very handsome letter of thanks to the inhabitants of the county of Cornwall for giving the Cromwellians more than they bargained for, or wanted even, on several occasions. This letter is still to be found, painted on boards in parish churches, and as conspicuously placed as the Lord's Prayer or the 10 Commandments. The practice of reading the letter in churches and chapels has long been discontinued, but the testimony to unselfish devotion and gallant defence of a sovereign whose star was setting in blood remains. Good Queen Bess rather liked Cornishmen, or said she did, which answered the same purpose. She said that Cornish gentlemen were all born courtiers, with a becoming confidence, 2 qualities which naturally attracted her as a woman and lady. Climate probably had something to do with native politeness, and that is why the Eastern races are so civil to one another. The people are like Japs for politeness to one another on a deal. When a man is drawing the longbow and coming it too strong, the other fellow will say, "I wonder if it is so," with the slightest possible accent of suspicion in his tone. We were present when 2 men were trying to make a deal in horseflesh. Halter for halter, as the saying is. The owner of a weedy-looking chestnut wished to swap with the owner of a useful black cob, and his rhetoric was florid. Sometimes he drew on his imagination to praise of the chestnut, and the owner of the black cob would say, "I wonder now, just by way of note of admiration." Then the chestnut's owner, growing bolder and more vigorous in his style, garnished his language with many fancy words and wound up by asking, "Don't ye believe me?" The other man replied, as politely as a Chesterfield, "I'll believe ye to oblige ye." The Foreign Office couldn't beat it. The Bookworm discovered that Cornwall had somehow linked itself with great names in history, or rather that some great names had linked themselves with Cornwall, using her as a gallant for a season, and then passing out of her life. Camelford had 3 successful wooers in Lord Lansdowne, Lord Brougham, and Ossian Macpherson. Lostwithiel was wooed and won by Joseph Addison. Then Horace Walpole, jilted at Callington, made up to Eastleigh, still attractive, when the great Lord Palmerston came along with a buttonhole in his coat and the Blarney. Then John Hampden found a first love in Grampound, and Sir Francis Drake, a soft place in the bosom of Bossany, a mere village close to the angry roar of Tintagel Sea. But all these seats were mere lights o' love, and some were swept away on account of their dissoluteness before the great Reform Bill, and then the rest went, and none were remembered on account of their gallant political lovers. I said it didn't make a bit of difference what the constituency was or where, so long as the man was right. He saw a great many advantages in the old pocket borough, and if he ever went into Parliament, which he might, as a stepping-stone to the woolsack, like the veteran Lord Chancellor who found comfortable quarters at Launceston, he'd like to have the fewest number of constituents, and those all of one mind. But the Bookworm would not have it that way, and stuck to his guns that it was the constituency which really had a seat in Parliament, and constituency and member were one and indivisible, and when not, there was failure somewhere in first principles. The Bookworm always takes these things so seriously, Guy says. Chapter 8. Most of the saints came into Cornwall dropping little bits of fame and reputation as they travelled from parish to parish, and from holy well to holy well. Old Fuller says they were born under a travelling planet. Neither bred where born, nor beneficed where bred, nor buried where beneficed, but wandering ever. Cornwall is known as the land of saints, and county teams are usually saints. The Saints versus Weekenders. 6 goals to 3. 5-1 on Saints. It sounds a bit curious, but you get used to it. The true story of the Saints is a little mixed. The giants and the Piskies come in, and wherever the Saints went, there was sure to be trouble. We picked up a few stories, not all in one place, but here and there. Those already published we weeded out, together with some which appeared doubtful. Some needed a little patching up in places, and the Bookworm said the most imperfect were the most genuine. The following were thought worthy of survival. King Tudrig and the Saints. Irish saints swarmed as thick as flies in summer in the reign of Tudrig the king, who built his castle on the sands at Hale, wherein it now is, only the X-rays are not strong enough to make it visible. This Tudrig was a good old sort, and was called Theodore by the saints, as long as he had anything to give. But the saints, letting it be known in the distressful land that they had struck oil, their friends and relatives swarmed across the channel in such crowds that the king was in danger of being eaten out of house and home. He summoned the keeper of the victuals and asked for a report. He had it, and it was short and sad, as sad in its way as an army store's inquiry. Every living thing in air and field and wood had been devoured. All the salted meats in the caves had disappeared. "And if you don't stop this immigration of Irish saints," said the unhappy official, "we shall be eaten up alive." The good king became serious. Whilst they were talking, a messenger came with the news that a great batch of saints had come ashore. The king and his keeper of the victuals, when there were any to keep, looked at each other solemnly. "Put the castle in mourning," said the king, when the new arrivals danced up to the gate with teeth well set for action and stomachs empty. The keeper of the victuals spoke sadly. "The good king died," he said, "the moment he heard that more saints had arrived. Those who came first ate all his substance and emptied his caves, and there was nothing left of him now but bones. The last words of the good king were, 'Give them my bones.'" The keeper of the victuals turned as though to fetch the good king's bones for the saints to feast on. But they, one and all, departed and spread the story. The king played the game and ordered his own funeral, and when the time came, he got up and looked through a peephole to see the procession. "The saints," said he, "have spared my bones, but they will surely come and see the last of me." But he was mistaken. The story that all the caves were empty spread, and there wasn't a saint left in the land on the morrow. Then the king showed himself to his own people, and then a law was passed entitled "An Act Against Alien Saints' Immigration." The country recovered its ancient prosperity, and the keeper of the victuals filled the caves with salted meats, and there were wild birds in the air and beasts in the field, and the king once more feasted in his own hall. St. Ia came across the channel on a cabbage leaf, and the wind and tide carried her gaily to King Tudrig's shore. But when the customs asked her what she had to declare, she only held up the cabbage leaf. As she was a princess in her own right, and good-looking for an emigrant, the customs officers were sad, but showed her a printed paper rule, Ixley, which stated that foreigners without luggage or visible means of subsistence must not be allowed to land. The saint pointed to the cabbage leaf and argued that it was luggage and visible means of subsistence, and would have made good her point but for the king's chancellor, who said that the cabbage leaf, being pickled, was a manufactured article, and liable to duty under the new fiscal regulations. St. Ia always left her purse at home when she travelled, so she was unable to pay the duty. Once more she committed herself to the mercies of the sea on her cabbage leaf, and was carried to St. Ives, where she landed and was made much of. She stayed there for a time, planted her leaf, and was blessed with a wonderful crop of pickled cabbages, the like of which had never before been seen or heard of. But she revenged herself upon King Teudric by writing to all the papers, and the saints, who deserted the king when they had almost eaten him up, made a fine howdy-do and an Irish grievance, and the bad name which they gave the king stuck to him. The saints wrote the books in those days, and those who came after repeated what they wrote, until the people believed, and called it history. Guy said it was very unconstitutional to lay the fault upon the king, who, it was well known, could do no wrong. It was the duty of the prime minister to bear all faults, and it was noticeable that many prime ministers were round-shouldered, so that they might carry faults lightly. The Battle of St. Breage. The Saints and Piskies had a battle royal at St. Breage. A 3-line whip was sent over to Ireland, and as soon as it was known that there was a little fighting to do, and a cracked skull almost certain, for the glory of God, the saints sent up a shout, straightened their blackthorns, and came across the water in whole battalions. The cause was popular. St. Patrick had driven the snakes into the sea, and why not the saints drive the Piskies out of Cornwall? Hurroo! Paddy's blood was up, and he was spoiling for a bit of fun. The saints had the best of it, but so much blood was spilt on both sides that the sand was turned into stone. There is no other such stone in the district, and St. Breage had a block carved into a cross, and set up as a memorial which may be seen to this day, only it has a hole in it which was made by the giant Golons, who wore it on his watch chain until the date of his conversion. When anything has to be accounted for in this land, put it down to the saints or the Piskies or old Artful, and you're sure to be right. Nothing ever took place in the ordinary course of things. A month of Cornwall would be enough to drive a modern scientist stark staring mad, said Guy. It would be curious to speculate what sort of world we should be living in today if things really happened, as they are said to have happened, between fairies and piskies, saints and giants, each possessing supernatural powers, and yet law and custom grew out of beliefs in the invisible visible, said the Bookworm. The story of an artful maid. There were women as well as men saints, and when a woman came to the front she made a sensation. St. Agnes was a woman. She was not born a saint, but became one. She was christened Anne, plain Anne, and was a good little girl with blue eyes and light brown hair much given to curl into love-locks. She stayed at home until she grew up and became restless and wanted to see the world for herself. She did not complain more than other girls that her dresses were not tailor-made, and she had no particular grievance, only she felt that she must have a change. She wrote a dear little note and enclosed one of her love-locks to her dear and loving parents, freely forgiving them all the trouble and expense she had been to them, and went on her own. She was supposed to be delicate on the chest, and Cornwall having a great reputation, she made all haste to get there. In those days there were a good many pilgrims on the road who used to entertain one another with stories of many lands and their adventures therein, and delicate little Agnes heard in this way about a famous Cornish giant named Bolster. Mr. Bolster was in many respects a monster, and his story had great interest for little Agnes, because it was said he changed his wife every New Year's Day. He was called Bolster because he used to smother the old ones. Agnes wanted an adventure, and as her saint-like qualities developed, she felt more and more drawn towards Mr. Bolster, until she determined to try her hand upon him. It was a bold thing, but Agnes was bold, and when she felt at all timid, she said aloud, "Courage!" Mr. Bolster was a very fine fellow, the colossus of his age. When his right foot rested on the summit of one hill, his left foot rested on the summit of another, and the only thing that troubled him was corns. And when the weather changed, sometimes he had such twinges that he often thought he had a conscience and wished to get rid of it. At other times his conscience was passive. Agnes heard about the corns, and a light played in her eyes of heavenly blue. She had an idea. New Year was approaching, and Mr. Bolster was on the lookout for a fresh partner of his joys. When Agnes sighted him, he was standing with one foot on Carn Bray and the other on Beacon, looking at the little virgins round about playing at touch. His habit was to make a selection, watch the young lady home, and then, at New Year's dawn, to carry her off just when she was busiest dreaming of mince pies. Agnes guessed that the psychological moment had come, so she walked up Carn Bray and tickled Mr. Bolster's right foot with a bramble, quite close to his pet corn. Mr. Bolster, thinking that conscience was at him again, lifted his foot angrily, but happily for Agnes, saw her kneeling at his foot. "Hulloa!" he shouted. Agnes presented her card. "Beautiful forever, Miss Agnes. Corns extracted, bunions attended to." Beauty at his feet, and the new year near. Corns extracted. Was there ever such luck? So he took the little maiden up in his arms and promised then and there that she should be the next Mrs. Bolster. "Not long to wait," he added with a chuckle, the present Mrs. B. not having turned out to his liking. Mr. Bolster had neglected his personal appearance very much lately, and when he sat Agnes on his knee in the gloaming, she began his education. Beautiful forever was her trademark. If only wore curls, what a head! Hyacinthine locks, what an Apollo! Bolster looked at her dear little love locks, and then put his great hand over his own hair, which was long and matted, and began to think that, after all, short, crisp curls would be an improvement. He did not surrender at once, but Agnes said she couldn't. She really couldn't be the next Mrs. Bolster and trim his pet corns unless he had hyacinthine locks. Like an up-to-date hero in a novel, she found a bit of chalk and drew on a blackboard the head of a Hercules with Apollo's locks. Mr. Bolster was touched in a weak spot, and to keep him soft, Agnes vowed that she would never be Mrs. Bolster until he was such a man, such a curled darling. Mr. Bolster's hair was long and matted, and Agnes got a rake and combed until it all came off, and there was none to curl. New Year came, and Mrs. Bolster, in possession, went the way of all the giants' wives, and Agnes sat upon Bolster's knee and wept because of her vow which she must keep. No curls, no Agnes. She stroked his bald pate, saying the new hair was sprouting already, and it would curl so sweet when short that his own mother wouldn't know him. Then Agnes put him on health diet to make him young again, and when his hair really began to grow, she became afraid, for she caught him heating the curling tongs in secret, as though he meant business at an early date. Agnes sat upon his knee and wept. He was so stout. She could not clasp his manly waist. He must reduce. He must. The tears were in her beautiful eyes. Once more she touched the spot, and Mr. Bolster the Colossus was soft. He'd do anything. And then he took an oath at which the stars trembled. There was a little basin in the rock which the giant used for shaving water now he had become a dandy. Water trickled down the crevice into the sea when the cork plug was removed. Agnes prescribed a little bloodletting, for she was skilled in phlebotomy. "Just a basinful, you know," she said, with great pleading eyes of heavenly blue. Mr. Bolster threw his mighty arm carelessly across the basin. "Only a basinful this time," said Agnes, pulling out the plug. "Wake me up when it's full," said Bolster. He slept and slept, dreaming of Agnes, and the vital stream flowed and ran down the crevice into the sea. And Agnes looked over the cliff and saw the sea blush and blush deeper still. "Is it nearly full?" asked Bolster in a tone of lazy happiness. "Not yet, not yet, my love," said Agnes, stroking his bald head where the curls were to grow. So he slept and woke up and asked, "Is it nearly full?" "Yet a little more. It runs so slowly now," said Agnes. And Bolster slept again. Agnes looked over the cliff, and the sea was deeply dyed. So great a stream had flowed from the mighty form, smiling in sleep, but pale in death. He woke and tried to rise, but Agnes soothed him, saying, "But a little more, 'tis nearly to the brim." And his last vision was of Agnes. So the land was rid of Bolster, but the people were not so thankful to Agnes as they might have been, so she skipped. She led a wandering life, making and selling an ointment which people rubbed over their eyes to make them see clearer, and her fame followed her, so people began to praise and dedicate churches to her. The place where Bolster was slain became St. Agnes, and the basin into which his life's blood flowed may be seen to this day. A pebble thrown in finds its way to the sea if there is nothing to prevent it. Guy said he liked to hear stories told on the spot. Things seemed so real. Here was the very basin which held Bolster's shaving water before it became the receiver for his blood, just as good being here as reading an illustrated article in a magazine. The Bookworm said the story was only one of a class, and it was quite easy to separate fact from fiction when we once knew how. In this case, Bolster was not a real person, but a snow god, to whom the people offered a virgin every new year to make him melt and let the earth bring forth her increase. St. Agnes made the people see the error of their ways. That was the ointment which she made for giving people clearer vision. And so it was said that she had slain Bolster. She was, no doubt, artful, and was all the more popular in consequence. It became a saying that "an artful maid is stronger than Bolster." Guy said he liked the story best as it was, and had no patience with the Bookworm's treatment of it as a myth. He'd put money on Agnes, he said, to make her way in the world as well as any 20th century woman. Chapter 9. A liking for stories of the saints grows with the supply. Bookworm discovered in them the makings of history, and Guy mere love for the marvellous and dramatic situations. He thought St. Agnes would work up splendidly. It is well that saints catch on, because one can't get away from them. No sooner is one out of the parish of St. A than he's into the parish of St. B, and from St. B to St. C, and so on through the alphabet. It must have been a sore trial to the Aborigines to see so many foreign saints upon the soil without visible means of subsistence, yet claiming exemption from income tax. Wherever there was a well, a saint took possession of it. The votive offerings of the natives to the bright sparkling divinity dwelling in springs of water, passed into their hands, the water cures became miracles, and chapels and baptistries were built over the wells. Chapels and hermits' cells abound. There is one spring which ensures a man from hanging, if he is but christened with its water in childhood. There is another in which a madman may be ducked until he is cured. There is another in which a maiden may see her future, and there are others which can cure sad souls and sadder bodies. As things are reckoned now, the best of the saints did not have a good time. The ruined chapel in the Saints' Valley was at one time the residence of a holy man, who never saw human form or heard human voice, unless someone in distress needed his good offices to heal or console the sick or dying. It was a dark and dreary cell, with 2 slits in the walls for light and air, and a thin stream trickled through and fell into a rocky basin outside, now green with fern and lichen. This feeble stream cut a channel in the rock, so we thought the cell must be pretty old, but there was no niche or anything to show that lamp or image swung from the roof or nestled somewhere to cheer the poor man. Whoever he was, he left no trace, not even a scratch in the rock recording his name. We would not have been much the wiser, after all, even if we had known the name of the poor human who endured torture here and had the courage to live, and not throw himself to the first wolves who came howling around. The ideas conjured up were unpleasant, and Guy gave a shout when he got outside, just to be sure that he was himself. He was sure, he said, no penal settlement in the world possessed a solitary system so depressingly solitary as this. He was quite prepared to take an affidavit, neither now nor at any time, to go in for honours in saintship. The Bookworm said stories of the saints made what we saw much more interesting than if we merely looked at them through the eyes of guidebooks. There was the cheese ring. What did Murray say? Just this. This remarkable object consists of tabular blocks of granite, heaped one upon the other, after the manner of cheeses, to the height of 24 feet, but has probably acquired its name from its supposed resemblance to the press employed in the preparation of cider. It derives its extraordinary appearance from the circumstance of the stones at the base being less than half the size of those they support, which are 10 or 12 feet in diameter. Hence, the shape of the pile is that of a huge fungus with a stalk so slenderly proportioned for the weight of the head that the spectator will find it hard to divest himself of the idea of its instability. He had, he said, made notes of a short story which accounted for the fantastic mass of weathered granite in quite a different way, and made of the stone a lasting memorial of the triumph of the saints over the early giants in the land. Faith against strength. St. Tew and the Giants. The story opened at a period when the saints had been some time in the land, and the people took kindly to them, and brought them fish on Fridays. The giants grew jealous and resolved on holding a conference, and when they were all assembled, Ufa was voted to the chair, because he had the broadest shoulders and the best headpiece of all the race from the Tamar to Polpedon. The question was, what shall we do with the saints? Various methods had been already tried. Boiling, baking, and grilling were no use. The giants were not a united family, and were fond of hurling rocks at one another, and fighting and wrestling for fun or glory, just as the humour prompted. Ufa, the president, put the matter before them in a statesman-like way, First of all, he counted 6 up, and then he counted half a dozen. Then he said, "If you take 6 from 6, there's nothing. But if you wipe out 6, 6 remains." The speech was so precise and clear that it was penciled down on a half sheet of notepaper, and in time became the model for future prime ministers. It was certainly very well received. Then there was a discussion, and some said one thing and some another, and when all spoke at once it was very difficult to know what was said or meant. The president tried to keep order, but was just as helpless as Mr. Speaker in modern days. Fortunately, it was an open-air meeting, and the sky was not cracked. St. Tew had a little well all to himself, but was a small and weakly man, who took cod-liver oil fasting. But he was young and full of zeal. The conference was held in what he called his sphere of influence, and when he heard the mighty shouts, he looked upwards and saw a sign. Then he hastened to the conference, and by dodging in and out between the giant's legs, he managed to reach the president, who was threatening to leave the chair unless better order was kept. "Pick me up," said St. Tew. So Uther picked him up and showed him to the assembly, and being a strong man himself, he admired pluck. "What do you want here, my little man?" asked Uther, thinking into which pocket he should pop him to ensure his safety. "I want to challenge you to a trial of strength, but let me speak to the giants," replied the saint. Uther stood St. Tew on the palm of his hand and held out his arm so that he might speak, which he did in a loud voice, telling them solemnly that they were warring against heaven and one mightier than they, and finished by challenging the mightiest to a contest of rock hurling. If he were beaten, all the saints would leave the land, but if he won, then the giants were to cease their persecution and be baptized with the sign of the cross. Now, Uther was a champion rock hurler, and it was a pastime with him to throw rocks like quoits, and so truly as to balance them one over the other, the top being the largest. The game was no child's play, and the assembly said if Uther would accept the challenge, they would abide by the result. When they looked at St. Tew and the rocks to be hurled, they laughed mockingly. There were 12 rocks in all. They had been used before and were fairly round. The smallest was hurled first, and Uther pitched it 100 feet. St. Tew's knees shook. What if his faith should fail now? He cast his eyes upwards, and then, oh blessed miracle! The rock was as a feather in his hand, and he hurled it with such precision that it capped number 1 as though it grew there. So the game went on, and the pile grew more and more like a mushroom. The giants shouted mightily when Uther's rock capped the saints, but when the saints capped Uther's, they groaned aloud and showed temper. It was the saints' turn to hurl the last rock, which, being the heaviest and largest, and having to be thrown the highest, required the greatest skill and judgment and strength. The slightest error, and the pile would topple over. The silence was so great that a grasshopper was heard to chirp. True as a die, the rock settled on the rest, and the whole mass swayed upon its stem, but fell not. The victory was not yet, and a 13th rock was brought, and so huge was it that the giant knew it was beyond his powers to hurl. But he raised it with both hands and threw it with all his might and strength, and fell prone to earth exhausted. The rock fell short and was rolled back to where St. Tew stood, trembling once again. Would heaven fail him now? But no, his eyes were opened, and he saw an angelic host raised a stone to his hand. carry it through the air and place it as a crown upon the ring, that man might wonder at for evermore. But the giants were blind with rage and saw not. Then Uther bowed his head in humility and confessed his sins and was baptized. And some followed his example, but more returned to their castles and did what scathe they could. But the saints rejoiced when they heard what St. Tew had done, and were made free of the land, and made so free with it that all the best they took to themselves, and so pursued the giants with soap and water and Sunday clothes, and so trimmed their beards and nails that the race dwindled and died out. So the saints triumphed, and the cheese ring is their memorial. St. Tew founded the Union of Saints, and then his troubles began in such earnest that he had to increase his doses of cod liver oil in order to bear them. He was nursed in his last days by the good St. Keen, who came over from Wales for the purpose. An elm, an oak, and an ash tree grew over his grave, whose roots formed an arch, and under the arch a spring of pure water gushed forth. So St. Keen lived by the well, and Cornish brides, drinking first of the water, wear divided skirts and feed their husbands with long spoons. Guy said he thought he had had enough of saints, both he and she, for the present.